The moment we stop running. There's a kind of silence most of us spend our lives trying to outrun. Not the peaceful kind, not the quiet of an early Sunday morning before the world wakes up. I'm talking about the silence that arrives when distraction disappears, when there's no conversation to hide inside, no notifications to check, no role to perform, just you and whatever lives underneath the surface. For a long time, I didn't trust that kind of silence. When I was younger, being alone felt like something had gone wrong. If a weekend passed without plans, I interpreted it as failure. If a friendship faded, I felt exposed, like I had somehow been reduced. Because in a culture that celebrates visibility, solitude can feel like erasure. But over time, I started noticing something uncomfortable. The moments I feared being alone were often the moments I was afraid of what I might discover. Have you ever caught yourself reaching for your phone the second things get quiet? Not because you needed it, but because you didn't want to sit in that space. Solitude reveals what distraction conceals, and that can be unsettling. There was a season in my life when a close friendship ended quietly. No fight, no dramatic exit, just distance, fewer calls, longer pauses, then silence. At first, I felt abandoned. Then I felt lonely. But eventually, after the initial ache softened, I noticed something strange. Without someone constantly reflecting my identity back to me, I started asking questions I had never asked before. Who am I when no one affirms me? What do I value when approval isn't part of the equation? What parts of me were performance and what parts were real? That season didn't feel empowering at first. It felt raw, but it was clarifying. And history is full of people who stepped into solitude not as punishment, but as intention. Henry David Thoreau walked away from society and lived alone at Walden Pond for 2 years. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't failing socially. He was searching. He wanted to strip life down to its essentials, to see what remained when noise was removed. He wrote that he went to the woods because he wished to live deliberately. That word matters. Deliberately. Most of us don't live deliberately. We live reactively. We answer, we respond, we adjust, we accommodate. Solitude interrupts that cycle. When you're alone long enough, you stop reacting and start observing. You notice your own thought patterns. You hear your internal dialogue more clearly. You begin to separate inherited beliefs from chosen convictions. And here's what I've slowly learned. Solitude doesn't empty you. It exposes you. At first, that exposure feels like vulnerability, but eventually, it feels like truth. There's something grounding about knowing who you are when there's no audience. And the strange thing is, once you stop running from solitude, it stops feeling like isolation. It starts feeling like alignment, swimming against the current. Going inward rarely looks impressive from the outside. It doesn't produce applause. It doesn't trend. It doesn't always make sense to others. It can even look like withdrawal. But there's a difference between retreating and recalibrating. The world moves fast. It rewards speed, opinion, reaction. It pushes you to constantly respond. But solitude creates space between stimulus and response, and in that space, something powerful happens. You get to choose. Marcus Aurelius understood this tension deeply. He was a Roman emperor, surrounded by politics, betrayal, war, expectation. He lived at the center of power. Yet the writings we remember him for weren't speeches. They were private reflections. Meditations was never meant for publication. It was his internal dialogue, reminders to himself about character, discipline, perspective. Imagine that. One of the most powerful men in the ancient world needed solitude to remain stable. He wrote to steady his mind against the chaos around him. He didn't escape responsibility. He cultivated inner order so he could meet it well. There's something profoundly modern about that, because today, chaos doesn't come from battlefields. It comes from constant connection. We absorb opinions all day long. We compare silently. We measure ourselves against curated versions of other lives. And without solitude, we lose our center. I used to believe happiness meant being included everywhere, being invited, being seen, being affirmed. But the older I get, the more I value something quieter, belonging to myself. There's a difference between being surrounded and being grounded. Solitude teaches grounding. It forces you to evaluate your relationships honestly, not from fear of losing them, but from clarity about whether they align. Some relationships feel intense but unstable. Others feel calm but distant. Some nourish growth. Some simply fill space. Without time alone, it's difficult to tell the difference. Swimming upstream isn't glamorous, but strength builds against resistance. There's an old metaphor about a river. Most people drift with the current because it's easier. It requires less effort. But the ones who learn to swim against it build endurance. Solitude often feels like swimming upstream socially. You say no more often. You step back from noise. You decline invitations that don't resonate. At first, it feels like loss, but eventually it feels like clarity, because you realize something important. Not every connection is meant to be maintained forever, and not every season of solitude is a sign of deficiency. Sometimes it's a recalibration before expansion.
The strength found in stillness. Here's the paradox I didn't expect. The more comfortable you become alone, the more whole you become with others. When you don't fear being alone, you don't cling. When you don't cling, your relationships breathe. You stop needing constant reassurance. You stop interpreting space as rejection. You stop confusing silence with abandonment. Solitude builds emotional independence, not emotional detachment. There's a difference. Emotional detachment is numbness. Emotional independence is stability, and stability changes everything. During the Great Plague of 1665, Isaac Newton returned home from Cambridge when the university shut down. He was isolated, removed from academic life, separated from structured intellectual debate. But in that quiet, something remarkable happened. He developed foundational ideas that later transformed physics and mathematics. What looked like interruption became incubation. I don't believe every season of solitude produces scientific breakthroughs, but I do believe it produces insight. When distractions fall away, your inner voice grows louder. At first, that voice can be critical, restless, overthinking. But if you sit long enough, without fleeing back to noise, something shifts. Your thoughts slow, your breathing deepens, your reactions soften. And beneath the anxiety of being alone, you discover something steadier, your core. There was a period recently where I intentionally stopped filling every free moment. No background TV, no automatic scrolling, no constant social engagement. It felt uncomfortable at first, almost like withdrawal. But then something subtle changed. I started noticing what genuinely interested me, not what was trending. I started recognizing which conversations energized me and which drained me. I started trusting my instincts more. Solitude doesn't make you antisocial, it makes you intentional, and intention strengthens connection. Because when you choose people from wholeness instead of fear, you show up differently. You listen better, you expect less, you give without bargaining. And perhaps the most surprising realization is this: joy becomes less dependent on external stimulation. You can sit alone with a book, walk alone at dusk, have dinner alone without feeling incomplete. And that quiet contentment is powerful, because once you can stand comfortably in your own company, the world loses its ability to destabilize you. If you're in a season of solitude right now, don't rush to interpret it negatively. Don't assume you're behind, or excluded, or forgotten. Ask instead, what is this quiet shaping in me? Because solitude isn't the opposite of connection, it's the foundation of authentic connection. It's where identity becomes clear, where values solidify, where inner strength forms. The people who learn to sit with themselves rarely fear being alone again. They walk into rooms grounded. They leave relationships with grace. They stand steady when noise rises. So maybe the real question isn't, why am I alone? Maybe it's this: what kind of person am I becoming in this silence? And if you stay long enough to find the answer, you might discover that solitude was never the problem. It was the beginning.